Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're going to be discussing Chapter 12, which is about the Great Depression. So we're going to first start out by the causes of the Depression, and the prosperity of the 20s was claimed by the Republicans. Remember that we said the 20s was known as the Roaring 20s and the Decade of Prosperity, and also the term Coolidge prosperity referred to the great economic conditions. So Calvin Coolidge and the Republicans got much credit for this. So therefore, in 1928, Herbert Hoover, another Republican, easily won the election. So we had some long-term causes of the Depression. One was that farmers owed too much money for new equipment. They had mortgaged their farms to buy all kinds of new farming equipment to farm more, and when the crops didn't do as well as they should have, they couldn't pay this money back. Also, after World War I, Europe was buying less of our crops because they were in poverty. And you couple this with the fact that 1/4 of our entire workforce was farmers, we had a bad condition. If 25% of your workforce is going through a hard time, in a lot of debt, not making a lot of money, it's going to hurt the nation as a whole. Number 2 is an uneven distribution of wealth. And if you will, look in page 369 of your textbook. You can press pause on this video to do that. But the wealthiest 1% of Americans earned the same amount as the bottom 42% combined. So all the money was at the top. And the rich weren't spending a lot of money, so that money wasn't keeping the economy growing. Now you can pause your book, you can pause this and look in your book on page 368. By 1929, Americans owed double what they had at the beginning of the decade. You remember one of the reasons for the great economic prosperity of the 20s was that there was a lot of easy credit. However, the consequence of that was we owed too much money as a country and citizens couldn't make their payments. And then we have the big thing, which is the stock market crash of 1929. Investors had been speculating or taking chances on stocks, and this worked for about 10 years, and then it all came crashing down. As we talked about in the last chapter, investors had been buying stocks on margin, which means they were borrowing money to buy stocks. And when the stocks started not doing so well, they couldn't pay back the people that had lent them the money. And the big event was what is known as Black Tuesday. 16 million shares were sold. In other words, people were selling, wanting to get out of the stock market. The bottom fell out of the stock market. The stock market crashed. This is known as Black Tuesday. So during the Great Depression, which lasted roughly from 1929 to the outbreak of World War II in 1941, the economy failed. Unemployment climbed, and there was a sequence, there was a cycle that happened within this country to bring about the Great Depression. Number 1, the stock market crashes. We discussed that already and some reasons for that. Number 2, banks started to fail because everybody's pulling their money out of the bank because they were afraid that there was going to be a total collapse. Companies were closing because they went bankrupt, and we had 1/4 of our entire workforce without a job. So remember, we've got 1/4 of our workforce who are farmers, and they're in horrible conditions because of their debt. Now we've got another 1/4 of our employees unemployed. So we've got half of our labor force either unemployed or in severely poor economic conditions. Without money to buy products, other businesses closed. And then one thing the government did do at this time was pass the Hawley-Smoot tariff. However, this caused other countries to retaliate and put tariffs on our products and further hurt our economy, sending it into a downward spiral. So because of this tariff and the economic problems of World War I, the Depression spread around the world. And now I want you to push pause on the video, and I want you to turn to page 372 in your book and look at that. Now, a key economist of this time, John Maynard Keynes, he said a lack of government help led to the Depression, and if the government would have gotten involved sooner, then we may have avoided it or lessened the Depression. So Americans were really facing hard times. And guys, what I want you to do now is press pause, and I want you to read page 374. And once you have read that, I want you to push play again. A couple things here. A bread line is where people line up for free food, and this happened a lot during the Depression because people couldn't afford to buy food. A Hooverville was a nickname given to makeshift shanty towns. In other words, homeless villages were popping up. And they named them Hooverville because they blamed Hoover for the Depression, because he was the president at the time. Just like Coolidge was the president during our great economic times, Hoover was the president during our poor economic times. So he got the blame for a lot of this. And now I want you to press pause, and I want you to read and look at page 376. Crop prices were plummeting because of overproduction. Wheat, for example, went from $2.16 a bushel to 38 cents a bushel. And between 1930 and 34, nearly 1 million people lost their farms. Again, they'd borrowed a lot of money to buy new farm machinery. Crops were doing poorly. They couldn't pay the money back. This led to some people becoming tenant farmers, meaning that they basically rent someone else's land and farm it because they couldn't afford to own land of their own. And that brings us to another event, and that is the Dust Bowl. Now, the 1930s were a hard time for Americans for many reasons. Number one is the Great Depression and the horrible economic conditions. Number two is the Dust Bowl. So I want you to look at page 378 and page 390, please, at this time, and press pause. What you're going to do is you're going to look at some things covering the causes, which is severe drought and severe windstorms. Those are things that were out of man's hands. And then we've got overfarming and grazing, which were in man's control. Those were things brought on by man. What were the effects? Many people had to move away, as you saw in the book. These people were called Okies. Many went to California where they could buy land cheap. Wealthy farmers bought the land cheap of those that had left. The government began helping farmers because they saw they had to, and they began to build dams in order to divert water into the Great Plains. So this might not happen again. Few interesting points. Some dust traveled as far as the Atlantic Ocean. That's how much dust there was. Dust would blow as hard as 100 miles per hour, and everything was always covered in dust. You'll see a picture of this for one of your assignments on Blackboard. So there were also some psychological effects on the people during this time. Number one, men felt ashamed because they couldn't provide for their families. There was this extreme sense of guilt that men had throughout the country. Birth rates dropped to an all-time low. There weren't very many children born during this time period. Family discipline dropped because they'd essentially gave up, and those with jobs felt a sense of guilt that there were so many people, about half the workforce in this country wasn't working, and they did have a job. So there was a phenomenon of men that did have jobs feeling guilty throughout the country. Hoover tried to respond, but he basically failed. He had a hands-off approach to the economy. He didn't think that the government should be involved greatly in the economy, and he believed the government didn't have the power to fix the problem. So he didn't do a whole lot of hands-on things to fix the situation. He did ask businesses to keep wages and jobs the same, the key word here being asked. He did not do anything to force them. He cut taxes and lowered interest rates, and he asked the wealthy to give more to charities, basically, again, showing his hands-off approach, hoping that the American people would help themselves. It didn't work, and Hoover's response of localism, in other words, where state and local authorities take care of the problem, it failed to fix the problem because the problem was so large. He did order the construction of what became known as the Hoover Dam, which was built in the 30s to provide jobs. Over 1 million people are powered by this each year, and please press pause and look at page 386 in your textbook. During this time, we have the Bonus Army incident, and if you will press pause and look at page 387, you can look at the pictures and read about that. Basically, in the 1920s, Congress promised to pay a bonus to World War I veterans in 1945. However, when the Depression hit, many people that were covered by this wanted it now. So in 1931, they traveled to D.C. to demand early payment. The president ordered Douglas MacArthur to remove what became known as the Bonus Army, the men that were camped out there demanding their bonus. And he used excessive force, including tear gas, fire, and bayonets. Now, the public was outraged when they saw the American Army fighting American veterans. And again, they blamed Hoover, which further hurt his reputation. And that ends our discussion of the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl. Thank you.